All right, this is the Regrettable Century. I'm Kevin, and we are doing a special episode today with a couple of guests. Today we have Arnold, who, among many things, does the Fight Like an Animal podcast, which is a series that offers a synthesis of behavioral science and political theory in search of paths to survival for the planet and our species. We've also got Mathias Nordvig, who is an associate teaching professor in Nordic Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. He also does the Sacred Flame podcast, which explores and reconnects the Nordic story worlds with our current reality, with an eye toward reinvigorating the modern world and reflecting on our place in it. Thank you both for being here and agreeing to do this. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
So the topic for today's discussion is the intersection of animism and political engagement. The other hosts of Regrettable Century have spent a bit of time lately on the show talking about their Christian faith and how that intersects with their political commitments. And they've bugged me about, talking about my own spiritual practices. So I figured talking to the two of you would be the best. I don't want to be the sort of emissary of, animism necessarily, but I figured bringing you two together and chatting with you would be sort of like a perfect way to do that. So to start with that, I want to sort of lay the groundwork for people who likely have no idea what animism is or what the hell I'm talking about even. So for each of you, how would you define that or explain that to an uninitiated person? Mathias, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I can go first. All right. Well, I mean, my explanation for it is gonna, veer into the academic as well. First and foremost, I want to say that animism is a perspective on existence. It's kind of a philosophy, but I would say maybe calling it a philosophy is, goes beyond the bounds of its way of existing in the world. At the end of the day, animism is most likely from perspective of history of religion, the way humans have started out looking at the world and perceiving their own existence and the existence of other things with them in the world. So it's a way of thinking about life and your place in the world where you attribute personhood to other things that we call things, right? in our post-Cartesian modern English language. So you will find this way of thinking typically with indigenous populations still around the world, Native Americans, Aboriginal Australians, and so on. They are some of the populations that have, despite attempts to kill it off, retained their way of thinking in animist terms about their reality. To connect it to a cultural context, I would point to the population I grew up with as a child, the Inuit in Greenland, and in their language, Galashisut, where their word for spirit is Inua, and their word for human is, one person is Inuk, derived from that word spirit, essentially. And multiple peoples are Inuit, right? So that's the term we use to refer to them, right? And this, when they talk about an Inua in an animal or in a human, they use the same term, right? So there's no distinction, and there's a general consensus that when you hunt for animals, you're essentially inviting animals into your your home. You're inviting their spirit, and it's only if you have good moral practices and have a comfortable home life that the animal will come to you, right? So there's that like moral connection to it as well in that particular cultural context. And I feel that sort of actually very clearly illustrates how animism plays out among indigenous populations. And for me, it's kind of similar. I wouldn't say it's a one-to-one with how Inuit think about it, but I'm mostly there.
Yeah,
Damn, that's well put.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I would echo the very first thing you were saying, which is that less than any particular explicit belief system or theory about the world, it's really a mode of perception. And when one inhabits that mode of perception, a set of conclusions or stories about the world tends to emerge from it that are strikingly similar, and kind of have this distinctly anti-modern tinge if you happen to be a person who grew up in a mass technological society. But there's these kind of like striking parallels between the stories about the world that emerge from these particular sets of experiences that people have, whether they're fighting coal mining in Germany, or they're doing what I did with a lot of my life of like blockading logging roads, or they're taking psychedelics and looking at the ocean, or they're indigenous people who never walked away from this more kind of integrative perspective. And the thing that I'll try to do there's limitations to how, one could over apply this notion, but since you have a podcast audience that is very familiar with the dialectic, and that, I'll say that I think that one way to think about animism is that we sort of understand the world in three basic stages. We have an initial kind of gestalt perception, like an intuition about what it is we're experiencing. And then to understand things better, there's a phase of analysis. We kind of step outside of the flow of experience. We distance ourselves from our embodied intuition, and we think like, well, how do I really know what I think I know? Is what I'm experiencing real? And we kind of like, we engage in reductionism. We break things apart. And then ideally, hopefully, there's a third phase of integration of those two ways of being and seeing. And you come up with something that's more than the sum of its parts, where you've gained this wisdom through analysis, but you still are immersed in the flow of experience and your sort of like sense of wholeness and connectedness. And I really think the modern world can be very aptly characterized as people stuck in the second reductive analytical mode of engaging with the world. And that we can talk all day about what it's like when you get to the third and final stage of perception and analysis, but words alone kind of never really convey the truth of it. It might all sound, the kinds of things we might say about animism, they may sound kind of true enough, but like maybe a little bit like platitudes. Sure, everything is connected, the world is alive in some sense, but it may not really feel that, like, it may not exactly like hit in a way that feels all that meaningful or impactful if you're not in a certain mode of experience or whatever.
Right.
Oh, and I'm sorry, to relate that to the dialectic, obviously the initial intuitive phase would be thesis, the analytical, radically skeptical antithesis. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, perfectly Hegelian of you, which, we definitely indulge in a lot of Hegel on this podcast. So, yeah. Okay, and then just to give the topic some sort of springboard, I asked everybody to read William Morris's short essay, Under an Elm Tree. And the reason I picked that text is because it's sort of a nice, neat little sort of, Venn diagram meeting point of the various different things that of animism, political engagement, and things that people who listen to this podcast would be somewhat familiar with. And why that is, I want to just give like a little bit of a framing for that. E.P. Thompson was a historian, a Marxist historian, British historian, and he wrote a biography of William Morris. And in that biography, he described William Morris as a pagan communist, which, since I read that descriptor, has been, sort of how I think of myself. Morris lived in England from 1834 to 96. In his youth, he identified as a Christian socialist, but he seems to have lost his Christian faiths by his college years and never really centered his politics necessarily in his life up to that point. In the first half of his life, he established himself as a well-known, at least around the British world, a well-known poet, writer, and designer. He was a founding figure in the arts and crafts design movement, rejecting machine production that came with industrial capitalism and embracing and reviving, really, traditional craft production. His writing often centered around various European mythological traditions, because that's what he had exposure to in his education. And in his life. Later in life, he settled into a sort of a daily grind of running his company, Morris & Co. That was a design business, and he had some events in his life that sort of broke him out of the monotony of that, and he went off adventuring and doing different things in his life. And he started getting invested in political activism. First, he made friends with an Icelandic man, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, but it's Eirikur Magnusson. And he started learning Icelandic and visiting Iceland. He became fascinated specifically with the Nordic mythological tradition, which was predominantly had not been translated to English at that point in time. And with Magnusson, Morris produced the first complete English language translation of an Icelandic saga. And his thinking and his writing afterwards were permanently inflected with the Nordic story worlds, to use Matthias's phrasing there. He also got involved with political activism. His activism started with opposing British imperialism in India, and with architectural preservation campaigns. He was really into opposing what he saw as, and I think he rightly saw as, capitalist enclosure of the commons, decimation of the ancient worlds, and he wanted ancient buildings and structures to be regarded as belonging to the public and not something that belonged to any private interests. He was inspired by the Paris Commune of 1871, and he became a socialist. In those days, anarchists and Marxists weren't so categorically distinct, and he organized with both. When organizational questions split the camps apart, during his time in leadership of those organizations that he was in, he found himself straddling the divide between the two. So he couldn't quite be neatly categorized in one or the other, but he had strong ties to both camps, and leading intellectual lights in the Marxist movement as well as anarchists of his time. Later in life, he became less active and focused more on writing, but through that time, he kept his political commitments. One way that he accomplished this was producing the journal Commonweal, which he edited and occasionally wrote for. In the 5th volume of the Commonweal in 1889, he published his short essay, Under an Elm Tree, or Thoughts in the Countryside. So this is the essay that I picked for us to read and discuss. In it, Morris uses his interaction and relationship with nature to reflect on his place in the modern world, his vision of a better future, and how he draws inspiration for this from the Nordic myths and pre-capitalist peoples to shape and fight for this vision of the future that he had. So I felt like that really, just brings together different strands, different threads into one fabric in a very, very unique way. And the more I've read and learned about Morris, I've really come to find him to be personally an incredibly inspiring person for myself, and somebody who I avidly I just want to learn more about him all the time. And I've started collecting. Like I've got a tapestry of a world tree that Morris and Co. produced on my wall over here, and I'm collecting various different things that Morris did in his life that I just find like so incredibly interesting and compelling. I want to, I guess, start with y'all's take on the text.
I really found, one of the things that was occurring to me reading it was how it was a validation of this sense that I have. I mean, that I guess I was just kind of touching on, that there are just an infinity of paths into this worldview, that it's like he took a walk in the country. And then at some point he started having these experiences of contemplating the unity of animal life, including, like this kind of perceptual return of humans to the circle of animal relationality and stuff like that. How it's like on the surface, we could describe this as this just very prosaic sort of, it's like he's taking a walk or whatever, but how this current, this way of perceiving the world, for as much as we live in times and circumstances that kind of inhibit that mode of perception from fully being expressed, or it's just always coming to the surface in all these different ways. And I love hearing, I'm a connoisseur of accounts of people's shifting worldviews. I love that stuff. And so that was kind of what I got out of it the most, was like, there you are, you thought you knew what the world was, but then you took a walk in the country and it turned out to be vastly more complex and interconnected than you ever could have imagined, that, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful writing.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it too. And, I'm trained in literature, so that's where I immediately started like digging into how is he constructing metonymies and metaphors in his language, like how should we be reading this? How should we be analyzing it? And one thing struck me was this way that he connects to the past with the white horse on the hill that he mentions. I assume that's the Uffington horse.
I think so,
yeah. But so that tells us also where he's located geographically, right? Which is quite interesting. And he refers to a battle to that happened up there on the hill, and I'm not entirely sure which one that would be. But that's where my persona as literary historian comes in. It's like, well, how is he treating the past, and how is he relating to the past? And it's very clear to me that he thinks of the landscape as imbued with ancestry, which is, in so many ways an animistic way of thinking, right? Because you look at a world, you look at the soil and dirt and the mounds, the hills and the mountains and all that stuff, and you realize, oh wait, this is the bones of my ancestors. And so I think that's an incredibly powerful way that he is thinking about this, and thinking about the relationship to land. And then he talks about, will people be fighting for this? How can we inspire people to keep fighting for this, right? And that's the powerful message here, right? You see yourself as this point in time that connects back and points into the future. at the same time. That's what I think is really, really cool about his text, actually.
I super agree. This is a point that I actually get really agitated about. There's an impulse, I think, among liberal thinking people or progressive minded people to bristle at anything that looks backward and connects to ancestry or romanticizes the countryside or anything like that. I recall there was an exhibit in an art museum. I think it was in a British art museum that I saw of romantic painters who painted landscapes of the British countryside. And there was a warning on the way in before you go in and look at these paintings about warning. This is, could lead you to into being a fascist or whatever, because it romanticizes the British countryside. And, what that is so starkly contrasted with a figure like William Morris, who takes a stroll through the British countryside and takes you along with him in this text here, where he says, he takes you on that little stroll, and he says, "What is that thought that has come into one's head as one turns round in the shadow of the roadside elm? A countryside worth fighting for, if that were necessary, worth taking trouble to defend its peace." And he refers back to the battle that you were talking about, Matthias, as this, concept of, fighting for this countryside, and this sort of romanticization of the connection between people and their land, and drawing that as inspiration for fighting for that. He, instead of connecting that to a blood and soil sense that we must rid the land of foreigners and return to our ancestry or something, our ancestral connection to the land, he instead uses that as inspiration to say at the end, suppose the haymakers were friends working for friends on land which was theirs, as many as were needed, with leisure and hope ahead of them instead of a hopeless toil and anxiety. Need their useful labor for themselves and their neighbors cripple and disfigure them and knock them out of the shape fit to represent the gods and heroes? And if under such conditions a new Ashdown had to be fought against capitalist robbers this time, the new white horse would look down on the home of men as wise as the starlings in their equality, and so perhaps as happy. He uses this very same point of inspiration as this is a countryside worth fighting for a better, equal future that's post-capitalist.
Yeah, and I also really liked how he did in fact mention the whole kind of, the socialist animosity towards anything that doesn't feel like contemporary, like we're racing towards a machine age future. Let me turn the leaf and find a new picture, or my holiday is spoilt. And don't let some of my socialist friends with whom I have wrangled about the horrors of London say, this is all that can come of your country life, and I think that there is like really something here about how there's a very finite number of sort of major moments of political upheaval, phases of revolution that really to this day define our sense of what human possibility looks like in a contemporary technological landscape, and what different sort of like belief, political systems of thought look like. And one of the major tragedies of the Russian Revolution was that they were so caught up in this, oh, you got to go through this, phase of urban, everybody has to go to college and work in a factory to gain the theoretical sophistication we're trying to imbue, the population with. And there was kind of this Russian revolutionary phase, the whole Narodnik thing, where they were trying to go to the countryside, but not really trying to understand people, sort of like really trying to like start with the preaching, like really like go heavy on the theory right out the gate. And then there was this kind of like, okay, the country people are illiterate and hopeless, and we just have to sort of, it's really just like a civilizing narrative in the very worst possible sense of the term. And that had so much to do with the starvation and misery and chaos that succeeded, that first really, really difficult period after the Bolshevik Revolution, but also just with the way, with the imposition of the hierarchies that came to characterize the Soviet Union, which in turn came to register, for so many people, the perceptual gestalt of like what socialism is like, oh, it's a dictatorship, and it's dreary Eastern Bloc architecture. And you really can trace a line there with that like animosity towards rural life, simple people and primitive customs and all that stuff, and these like horrors and absurdities that these like rational scientific modes of political thinking ended up begetting.
Yeah. I love that. There's so much to reflect on with this. Uh, as Arnold, as you was just talking about, I was reminded of some of the things I tell my students when I teach indigenous cultures in the Arctic. I teach a class on that. It's just called Arctic Culture and Society. And one of the things I always point out to them, because we're circumpolar here, that means, Canada, US, Denmark in sense of Greenland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, right? And we have, in so many ways, like so many different ways of organizing society represented here. We have monarchies like Denmark and Norway and Sweden. We have republics, Finland, Iceland to a degree. We don't really talk too much about Iceland because it's just below the polar circle. And then we have, of course, Canada, the constitutional republic, and the US as a constitutional republic as well. In Canada with this like weird relationship to the British Crown for some reason. I think they still put them on their coins. And then we have Russia, which is this like a strange place when it comes to the last 100+ years, right? We have a first an empire ruled by a Tsar, and then we have a Soviet communist regime, and then we have a modern republic for like 5 minutes, and then we have whatever Putin is, and I always tell my students, look, there's really no difference from the perspective of indigenous populations here who are being colonized. Whether it's a Soviet system that forces them all into obscene and collectivizes their reindeer herding and makes them fly around in helicopters to do it instead of like singing to their reindeer. That's what happened to the Evenki. Like they had these like practices of herding reindeer by singing to them, and then contrast that with the introduction of a helicopter where they're basically flying over, going butter, 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 right? Like, I mean, I think that says it all in terms of like this like modernizing. Now we need to civilize this like rural population, right? And the same kinds of things have been, happening in Canada. These things have been happening in the US as well, right? And the Danes have done the same thing to the Greenlanders, and the Norwegians and Swedes and Finns have done the same thing to the Sami, right? In on various levels, some are less violent than others, but at the end of the day, it's violence, right? Regardless of what's happening here, because those peoples, they don't have the option to choose. Do I want to engage with this or do I not want to engage with this? They're basically just forced to be part of this particular process. And this had me thinking, now I'm not a socialist or a Marxist myself, but I was thinking that, the left, Marxism, socialism in the 21st century, 20th and 21st century has really done itself a disfavor here by eschewing the ancestry, connections to land, and connections to the past, right? Because that's what we see with the Soviet system is is very like a modernizing machine. That's the purpose. We're barreling forward here. We're going towards a new age of some kind, and we're forgetting about the past. We're leaving everything behind because, in that particular Russian cultural context, right? This is what they didn't really think about, that they were in a specific cultural context. But in that specific cultural context, all of these old things signaled feudalism, signaled repression, and starvation, and the death of the people. All of those things, right? So we can't look back. We can't love our land. We can't have respect for our land, and we can't have respect for our ancestors, right? That's the kind of communism and socialism that's spread across the world, except for in certain places here and there. You find it in the Chiapas, where they are very indigenous in their socialist approach to things, have been, at least traditionally.
That's the UZLN, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so what has unfortunately happened here is that there's one particular political way of thinking that has been connected to the past and has sort of like that claim of tradition. And that's that weird blob that's called conservatism, right? They're the ones that can say we represent some kind of tradition, something of the past, some good stuff from the past. And that's not true at all, especially not American conservatism. Does not represent anything really from the past. They represent stuff that's been invented within the last 70 years, roughly. So it's like they don't have a claim to the past, but they do claim the past, right? Exactly. And that's really unfortunate, because it means that all of these people out there in the world who live these normal lives and this is where I would say, for most people, they are actually doing animist things in different ways, like connecting to their past, like connecting to their ancestry, like connecting to, the land that they live on. Like, if you have a garden and you cultivate that garden and you love doing that, then you're doing some animist things right there, right? So all these people, they end up feeling alienated because they see these political projects out there sort of like lacking any connections to tradition and the past, and all these things that are inherently meaningful to us as humans, right? I think this is also why so many of us are, very skeptical about tech stuff and technological advances and all the things that are happening in AI, and I think rightly so as well. Many can see that dystopian future, and it is because it is so disconnected from our nature as humans, and our nature as beings that are connected with all of these other beings right here in our immediate space, right? This is also why I think, our psyches are crumbling under social media, right? Because we get disconnected from our bodily experience with that. And to just round this off, in my own little crazy animist way of thinking about everything, when you were reading the passage, Kevin, I was sitting there and my mind was going in a specific direction, thinking of the smells. How must it have smelled there in that space?
Right.
Like, it must have been incredible. Just like, to all your senses, go back that far back, right? With where you still have so much diversity in the English landscape at the time, right? Monocropping has done away with a lot of that diversity in most Western spaces at this point. If you live in the Midwest, definitely gone. If you live in, Northern or Central Europe, it's definitely gone. Like, there's so much plant and diversity of life overall that has disappeared. And so, like, that was what I got, like, overwhelmed with, like, sort of like maybe even like a memory of those smells in some kind of way. And that was just, that's the kind of stuff that means everything to me. And when we talk about, like, fighting for stuff,
yeah,
that's where I'm at right there.
That's a countryside worth fighting for. Yeah, I mean, he's Morse is honestly, he's a really good writer. Once he doesn't write for the modern ear, that's for sure. So there is some adjustment of sort of like getting into his way of writing. But like, he conjures up these sensory feelings, and the very first sentence is, he says, walk between the fields and hedges that, as it were, one huge nosegay for you. He's specifically calling your attention to these different sensory experiences that you have being in the countryside. We just recently did an episode on the podcast on the speaking of technology, on the Luddites and what the Luddites actually were and what they actually did. We talked about how, contra what the term has come to mean in the contemporary mind, what the movement actually was small individual artisanal producers or workers who were being, at the very outset of capitalism, starting to be gathered together in a shop, who were perfectly happy to accept any piece of technology that bettered their lives and made their lives easier, and made their crafts less burdensome on themselves. But they very pointedly and very specifically attacked and threatened their bosses, and destroyed machines that were being introduced for the purpose of de-skilling their labor so that they could be paid less. The Luddites were actually an early workers' movement.
It was a labor movement, but also, I mean, doesn't that sound kind of conservative?
Yeah, it was.
Like,
yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're there to preserve something, right? And thirdly, I was already thinking about this earlier on, before I went into my rant, because what is Morrison himself, like what is he doing himself? Well, he is connecting to an English past. Like, some of the stuff that he's talking about has been in existence in English culture for 300 years prior to him. Like, think about Gerard Winston, for instance, who was like building communes on the commons back in the 1600s. Like, this is to say that labor movements, for instance, to say that this rejection of capitalism, corporatism, all that kind of stuff is like something new and something that does not have any tradition. That's just nonsense, because we can go back the last 2,000 years in European history and trace moments where people have done that all over that particular part of the Eurasian continent, right? And I'm sure that is possible in other cultures as well. Go to China and you will see the same thing historically happening over and over. So this like, right now, all this stuff is captioned as like left and right, conservative and liberal and so on. But it is, at the end of the day, a very foundational struggle for humans, right? The human need to have control over your own processes, the human need to engage in social and society building on terms that you can actually accept and agree with, or be a slave, right? Because that's the other option. There are only these two options, right? Either you have choice or you're a slave. And you're still a slave even if you're being paid some kind of menial wage. And why do we know that? Well, we know that because when employment was introduced as like a basic means of existence, people were like, "That's slavery, guys." Also here in America.
Right. Hence the term wage slavery. Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Interestingly, yeah. I mean, I think you can see that these different, to sort of tie that together to. So I can hear many people who listen to this podcast and my podcast hosts getting mad at me for not objecting to you two criticizing the Soviet Union. So let me be the voice of the Marxists here for a minute. But to be able to tie that together, you can look at the origins of the workers' movement, which is in hindsight, we refer to it as the First International. At the time, it was just the International Workingmen's Association, constituted by the labor movement broadly across Europe, but the major sort of poles of attraction in in that organization were the anarchists and the Marxists. And broadly speaking, the workers who congregated under the anarchist label were the craft producers who were anti-capitalist in the sense of preserving the old way of producing with autonomy as producers with autonomy and self-direction and that sort of thing. And the Marxists were broadly the advocates of organizing those workers who were already proletarianized by the process of the enclosure of the commons and industrial production created by early capitalism. And so you had these two different camps that had a material basis, but laid on top of that, that is the ideological expressions of each camp. And as you noted, Arnold, that the Soviet Union was, and I guess you both talked about this, that the Soviet Union was unabashedly a modernizing project, and that's absolutely true. One thing that I've actually been reading about recently, the latest issue of Monthly Review magazine is all about socialism and the commune, which is explicating, or it's looking at socialist projects around the contemporary world that are arising out of and based on or centered on the development of sort of organically existing communes that exist in, say, Venezuela or the Far East or wherever, and how they're integrated into this project of building socialism. And part of what the issue does is it also explicates this piece of Marx's analysis, or his attention, that was drawn to looking at the development of the commune as a basis for developing socialism later in his life. And all of that writing and that thinking that Marx came to very late in his life was not available to the Russians, to the Bolsheviks, and their analysis was absolutely very, very rooted in an earlier Marx that was purely looking at the modernizing capabilities of capitalism as a positive and necessary element of history with a capital H. Mm-hmm. I want to say, though, that even without the benefit of that, the more complicating sort of way of attempting to build socialism in a world that hasn't been totally fully developed and realized into a fully industrialized society yet, is the modernizing impulse of the Soviets wasn't just ideological. They were also operating with a given set of material constraints. People will, on the one hand, I think oftentimes rightly, criticize the Soviets for the brutal modernization efforts that they undertook. Fair enough. But on the other hand, they'll then try to lambast the Soviets with the mass starvation that occurred during a famine that happened I think it was in the 30s, mostly in the Eastern Bloc. Ukrainians refer to it as the Holodomor, but in an attempt to call it, associate it with the Holocaust. But every scholar who's studied this in the Soviet archives has agreed that it was not a targeted extermination of any given population, but rather was a natural famine. And the worst that could be said of it is that the Soviets unintentionally, but mishandled it and exacerbated what would have been otherwise just a natural famine, and that caused mass deaths. And no doubt it was an awful thing that occurred. But you know what happened in the Soviet republics after that? After this brutal modernization push, this millennia old cyclical famine cycle that occurred never happened again. They transcended it because they modernized the economy and into an industrial mode of production. They had enough surplus at that point to be able to escape the famine cycle. So, whatever criticisms are had of the Soviets, and and I'll say, there's no you'll get no qualms from me about rightful criticisms of them. They have to be placed in the context of the material conditions that they were operating in. They had very, very constrained choices, and they had to pick a lesser of evils, to put it in a familiar framing. And in a world where we already, in a Western post-industrial society, we've got a sort of degree of surplus that point that the Soviets went through of brutal modernization is sort of set aside. We don't even have to talk about whether it's worth it or not to do in our society, because capitalism has already done the industrializing here. We're already post-industrialized and post-industrial at this point, which, when people say post-industrial, what they really mean is imperial extraction. We've pushed the worst of the environmental impacts and extraction of surplus labor value to the periphery, to the third world. I also want to say, I was listening to I forget their names, but I was listening to a couple of anthropologists who went and studied in the Soviet Union. I think it was in the 80s, and they were specifically looking at the native peoples, how the native northern peoples in were interacted with the world and in the Soviet Union, and the way they framed the policy of the Soviet Union toward the northern native tribes was, yes, they were called on to modernize, but it wasn't in the sense of the way that is done in Western capitalist powers countries like in Canada or the United States or Northern Europe, where native peoples were called to assimilate to the broader population. Rather, they were being called on to, like the whole of society, to develop into a new way of being. And much of that, we can look at that and criticize the things that they threw out, like singing to the reindeer, and the things that they adopted, like rounding them up with helicopters. And I think we rightfully should look at the choices with a critical eye that were made with a critical eye. But I think we should also recognize that there is a distinction there between a society that says we are going to actively, before any Western countries ever did this, we're going to actively preserve cultures and preserve languages, indigenous languages, and call on the indigenous peoples, like everyone else in society, to develop into this socialist world that we're trying to create. Versus a society that just says you must assimilate to, our way of operating. And this is, I think, can be seen by another anthropologist that I was recently listening to, who studied in Laos, which is a small Southeast Asian communist country. And she was talking about her experiences there, where the way that the Laotian people understood this process of, I guess you could call it modernization, was a conscious self-making, where they undertook the process of looking at themselves and looking around the world and deciding, choosing what we feel, what we believe is the best of what is available to us. And we are going to keep what we believe is good about our culture and our traditions and our ways and our practices, and we are going to discard the traditional practices that we don't like. Some very harsh patriarchal practices like menstruation huts and whatever else, things like that. Gender equality was radically improved under Soviet rule in these indigenous tribes and in Laos, for example. And they can, so when done right, I think it can be a process of self-development self-development rather than assimilation.
Mm-hmm. No, Kevin, I can really appreciate what you're saying here, especially considering the backdrop for all of us here, the Western world, right? Like, we are fed like hardcore propaganda about what Soviet Russia was. And the fact of the matter is that it was a lot of different things, just like the U.S., right? Like, we all live here in the U.S. and we know that the U.S. is a lot of different things, right? But people outside of the U.S. don't necessarily know that, right? Because they've been fed propaganda about the U.S. Either it's American propaganda, or it's, it could be Chinese propaganda or Russian propaganda or some other kind of propaganda about the U.S., right? And obviously there are aspects of that propaganda that are true. That's the point with propaganda, right? You take true anecdotes and then you put them all together to form a lie. That's how propaganda works. And so the famine, for instance, is a good example of a true anecdote that is then put together to shape this lie about a Holocaust on the Ukrainians, right? Or how their 5-year planning systems didn't work, or because all the trains with grain ended up in Siberia, some dumb nonsense like that. That's not because they weren't stupid. That's not how it worked, right? But that's how the West would like to frame it, because the whole idea is that, if you have a system like that, then you don't have free thinking, and then you don't have people who can make independent choices, and so everybody is sort of just an ant operating like a robot, and that's not been the case either, right? And yeah, you can point to a bunch of things about, for instance, Russia's or Soviet Russia's treatment of indigenous populations or non-white populations overall that are very different from what we see here in the West. I mean, the same kind of racism as we have it here does not, or did not exist. I don't know how it is now, but it definitely did not exist in the West. In the East. Back in the day. One of the things that always comes to mind for me is the mural on the Alexanderplatz in eastern Berlin, right, where you have is this beautiful mural on a high rise that displays women scientists, and I think there's a couple of black guys, and it's just diversity, right? And that was made back in the 50s, if I remember correctly, 50s or 60s, right? So that's an entirely different way of thinking about collaboration and the possibilities for different peoples, right? That did not exist at the same time in the West. And especially not here in the U.S. We had to make laws to even allow, non-white populations to vote, right? Now we're, eroding those laws, and have been ever since we made them, right? So, there's a lot to be said about good things that have also happened in Soviet Russia, and the Eastern Bloc overall. I think that's important to keep in mind as well. And as you're pointing out, there's a response to material conditions, right? What we also have to keep in mind is, one, you have a revolution, then you have a social project, an experiment. We can see that when we read Lenin's letters on the new economic policy, right, from 1918 to 24. He keeps rethinking, what do we do? How do we do all of this stuff, right? And they try one thing out, and then that doesn't work, and then they try another thing out, and so on, right? And that's an experiment. And then at some point things stabilize, and then you have, material conditions like a famine that occurs, right? Because that's what famines did prior to how we managed to hack farming, right? And that might also be causing a global drought at one point. But we're right now running on borrowed time with that one. Right?
Yeah.
And so it's like they worked out those problems that they run into, and I think they did it in a reasonably skilled way overall. So yeah, I think that's a reasonable way to think of it. And you can also, if we look at indigenous populations when it comes to like Denmark and its relationship to Galashinunaat or Greenland, right? It's another example of how you have a repressive regime that definitely undermines a culture and a way of life, but at the same time, there's a presence in that regime that also allows for that culture to actually retain many aspects of itself. Like there's a reason that Galashinunaat is one of the most sort of quote unquote developed languages among indigenous populations, right? Because they started recording the language already in the 19th century, and by 1862, I think it was, there was a newspaper in Greenland in Galashinunaat, right? So there's publications in the language as well. While go here and you're seeing genocide happening at the same time on the indigenous populations. So you could also point that out as sort of like something positive that comes out of a certain regime's way of approaching it, and that's how it is, right? There's not a one size fits all approach to this, and we have to always look at the complexities of history, right? But that's not what propaganda wants to do.
Right.
Never. Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, a way that I like to think about this, or that somebody else chose to think about this, that I strongly endorse, is James C. Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Failed. I don't know if you guys read that, but he does this great job. He calls this kind of way of thinking about and attempting to administer and order society from like a very high level, like a mile off the ground, like hyper rational schematic kind of perspective. He calls it authoritarian high modernism. And, in his Hall of Fame of authoritarian high modernists, it's everybody from like the Shah of Iran and Robert McNamara to like Leon Trotsky, right? And, what he's pointing out is that this utterly transcends ideology, that there was this phase of modernizing projects all over the world where people starting from very different overtly stated theoretical vantage points kind of like converged on these very similar ways of talking and looking about the world and creating chaos and misery, at least, more often than would have been optimal. And then the way that reverberates, the way that those historic processes reverberate through our contemporary landscape of perceptions, is that whole propaganda thing of like the selective curation of anecdote. We can talk about any of those high modernist projects and be like, oh, that's what happens when you apply this kind of ideology. That's what leftism is. That's what socialism is, or whatever. And it's like, yeah, it's also what, all of these other supposedly massively divergent ways of, ideologies or systems. It's also what they produce. But so, we get these stories about what words mean and why equality is bad and things like that, right, that are, just like really pretty stupid, but they're all based on pointing to things that really did happen and just like not looking at them in a contextually integrated fashion. And
I would say in the same way we can do that with a monarchy or constitutional monarchies or, capitalism for that matter. Like capitalism has managed to bring, sustenance to a whole lot of people. That doesn't necessarily...
You sound like Marx now.
Well, I mean, I might have read a little bit here and there. No, I mean, so fair is fair, right? Like we have to be fair in our assessments of these systems and say, they have brought good things and bad things. There are some great strides that have happened and some miseries that have happened too. The question is at the end of the day, as human beings, what do we think is how do we think we should approach our existence, though, right? Like how, what is it that is the best way of, or how is it the best way of doing that? How can we best relate to our own existence? And one thing that we can definitely say about modern society, whether it is a cozy little Nordic welfare state, or it is America, or it's Brazil, or it's South Africa, or it's China, or India, that is that we're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
We're essentially doing it wrong, regardless of what kind of social constitution we have, and what kinds of like ideologies we believe in, what kind of propaganda we believe in. We're definitely doing it wrong, because if we're not doing it wrong, you know, everything on the other side of that mountain over there, on my west side of me, would not be on fire. Like right now, right now, everything smells like a bonfire around me because we have massive wildfires here in Colorado, right? And that's that's not natural. It's just not natural, right? And so we have to rethink our existence. We have to rethink our approach to society and our approach to fellow humans. And that's where I would say animism is the way to go.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. Is I think it was Adorno, I guess the Frankfurt School, who were generally discussed the problem of disenchantment of the world as the product of the Enlightenment project. That I think, Mathias, having heard you talk about this sort of thing, I feel like this is exactly what you're sort of discussing, that animism addresses, is the problem of disenchantment. Animism is a solution to that. It's like the Laotian people, I would say. We're looking around the world and we're seeing what are the technologies available to us, and I think animism is one of the technologies that's available to us to address this problem of a disenchanted world by re-enchanting it and finding ourselves, rather than trying to use the world around us, instead trying to put ourselves into relationship or relation to the world around us.
Yeah, actually, there's one thing that I've been battling with in all of this, and that is, imagine that utopian society where production doesn't happen because you're in competition. Can we humans live like that? Like, especially those of us who've grown up in the Western world, where propaganda has fed us that narrative that we always need to be in competition. Like, what would a world without competition look like? And what would we do to fulfill perhaps the need for competition? Where would we go, so to speak? And I can think of multiple scenarios for that. Like, you could be hunting, you could be doing exercise, gymnastics, bodily movements. If we channeled all that competitive energy not into production and economy, but into our physical social bodies instead, I mean, I think there would be a lot more happy people out there, right? Like, because we know that the science backs that, right? If you're physically active, you're more happy. That's just something that happens, and obviously we would perhaps also, do away with a lot of, illnesses that we currently suffer from, right? Because, capitalism was so good at least supplying calories, right? Not necessarily sustenance as such.
Right. Yeah, that's actually something that's a through line in a lot of Morris's writings. Is in his later years, he also started writing just for fun. Started writing fictional stories about sort of imagined medieval worlds infused with supernatural elements, and especially with bits of Nordic mythology. And it was, as an aside, it was those writings that inspired J.R.R. Tolkien to write Lord of the Rings, which created what we now know of as the fantasy genre. But a repeated thread in his in Morse's fictions is this fantastical world where everyone is youthful and invigorated and healthy and robust and active and suntanned and all these things.
Wow, he even came up with suntanned back.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's always like, maybe he would use a different word or whatever, but like clearly have gotten sun, instead of being shriveled away.
I mean, that's like really alternative thinking for the Victorian era. Actually,
it absolutely was. Yeah, and. Yeah, because his vision was like capitalism shrivels the humanity in all of us, the ruling class and the dominated alike. And in a future world, he envisions we're all going to be youthful and vivacious. And he also notably uses that same motif in a book that he wrote called News from Nowhere, which is the framing of it is a guy is walking home from his socialist meeting, and he's thinking to himself, how I wish that I could live to see the future, the socialist society where everyone's free and equal. And then he wakes up and he finds himself in a fully realized, totally egalitarian, post-state communist world, and the whole book is just him wandering around and sort of exploring everything. And in that book, this future world where everybody is free and equal, everybody is just like in his fantasy works, where they're all just youthful and vivacious and robust and healthy and all that. So you can clearly see like this is that thing is tied to his vision of what a freer world would look like.
I wanted to mention, just in terms of the way that animism relates to concrete projects, political projects, in the very bizarre reality that we inhabit in 2025. Kevin, I know that you and I talked a little bit about, you saying something like, a thing that I haven't found to be terribly successful in life is like sitting down at a table with a room full of people under some fluorescent light somewhere and like arguing about the right way to save the world and have the revolution. Like what tends to happen, from my life of political organizing is some version of what you were describing with the socialist anarchist split, where you can see like different developmental experiences shaping these kind of like really niche, like at this point we live in such a more complex society with so many different social roles that produce different have different developmental consequences that produce different worldviews. Then you get this room full of people together in this kind of like disembodied, abstract environment of like, okay, we're going to map out the revolution in our heads together. And what happens is this infinite process of fracture, this infinite process of differentiation, of sub-tendencies, diversifying into further sub-tendencies. And, it's distinctly, like I was saying at the beginning, it's like, wow, this really feels like we're caught in the analytical mode in the most literal sense. If analysis is splitting things apart, we're doing an awful lot of that. We're doing an awful lot of atomizing here. And what I think we can kind of take away from some of what animism means and is that we can sort of assume that's always going to happen if there's not some set of embodied experiences that we share together that create a sense of collective meaning. We might call these something like rituals, but something that takes us out of that more disembodied analytical mode, which is important, which I value and embrace. I mean, I make a podcast with a bunch of like brain science in it, right? Like I like that stuff. But you do need to return into this more like immersive mode of being, or you'll always just do stuff like that. And so for me, that's kind of the fundamental question, is like, how do we awaken a capacity for a shared sense of meaning? And I would just really say like participatory contact with a shared reality, that allows us to not argue about every detail of every step we have to take, but to just kind of like find. And sometimes you do see that happen, especially when political movements create a little momentum, is often when people kind of get past all their arguments and suddenly they're like, oh, we're doing this. Like we could just do this. And, and there's like, suddenly there's this flow that was distinctly lacking before. And I think of animism as creating a culture, a set of practices, a way of being together that allows that to happen.
Yeah. Song and dance, man.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that is, if you look at it phenomenologically across the globe, right? That's what humans do. They sing and dance together, right? So this is where it gets funny with the Western world, right? Because we sit here in our little, weird prisons of minds at this point, and think that we can work things out by just being analytical. And that's why I alluded to social media earlier, because that exacerbates exactly that problem, right? The disembodied approach to existence, right? And one of the things that have always struck me about the way that we have ended up organizing society is that, at this point at least, nobody seems to be happy. Like, it doesn't matter where you're at on the socioeconomic ladder. Nobody really seems to be happy. Not even the people who look like they're happy seem to be happy, if you ask me. Because
they're all putting on the performance of being happy at best. Yeah.
Essentially, yeah, right. And so that tells me again that, guys, we fucked up. We literally fucked up. and we got to figure something else out, right? Because it's very easy to end up in a state of mind where you are like, okay, not being happy is normal, especially because everybody around us is not happy either. But that is entirely unnatural. And when we look at the things that actually make us happy, right? And sometimes we experience it, like, at least briefly. We go to a festival in the forest, for instance. So like, wow, hey, I'm happy. I'm relaxed. I'm not stressed out about anything. I mean, I just a week and a half ago, I was at Fire in the Mountains, and it was like all my problems disappeared completely. I was like, in the Blackfoot Reservation, far away from everything. There was no reception on my phone. I couldn't use my phone. I could just like look at all the happy little frogs in the lake, and the bald eagle that was like flying above, listen to cool music, and talk to a bunch of friends, because there was like friends everywhere, right? And it was like, holy shit, this is what it feels like to be happy.
Right.
And then you come back to these like prisons with windows and heating and fridges that we live in, right? Because at the end of the day, they are imprisoning us in different ways, because they're detaching us from other humans, right? And then we get desperate and seek that attachment through social media, because there aren't like any bodies around us except for our immediate family and some friends here and there, right? And so we like seek it on social media, and that's the disembodied experience of social interaction, which sucks, because you much easier get into arguments with people. That's very well established at this point, with research that it's very easy to run into a conflict on social media, because you are disembodied, right? You would not say the same stuff to people if you were face to face with them. It's kind of the same thing that happens in cars, right? We sit there in cars, and then we get like really mad at like the way that some person is driving, and then we attribute some reason to that that's probably not true. They are probably doing something else than we expect, but we take it as a personal offense. And then, at least if you live in the Denver metro area, you might have a shootout about that, right? We have an awkward amount of shootouts about driving in the Denver metro area. So, this is the kind of stuff that's like making us sick, right? This is a sickness. And animism, in my experience, is the answer to that, because that is what brings us back to our humanity. And that's what we need to cultivate. And I'm at the point now where I'm like, well, if that means that we have to just like ditch it all, I'm okay with that.
Right.
Like I'm okay with not having running water and central heating and all that kind of stuff. Fuck it. If I can just be happy and die at 35,
Yeah. Without modern medicine. Yeah.
Yeah. All those basic things.
People will sometimes sort of point to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia as an example of degrowth communism in practice. Yeah. That's what it looks like. Good luck.
One question so there's a couple of things to consider with this, like this notion of like, oh, if we go back to a pre-tech way of existing, we're going to basically just have like a life expectancy of 35 years and that's it. So first and foremost, we have to keep in mind that that's actually not true. The reason that the life expectancy is at 35 is because 50% of kids die.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So
if you make it to adulthood, you're actually probably going to make it into your 60s or 70s or something like that.
Yes, you could easily. At least that was the case for the Roman Empire. Like people who made it into adulthood, they lived up until some got into their 70s and possibly even 80s. So that's one thing to consider. Okay, so that means infant mortality is pretty high, right? But the question is also, if you live that kind of life, like, is that quality of life higher? No, that's my big question. Right. If you can run around naked on the plains, riding horses and hunting deer or something like that, until you croak at the age of 15 or something like that, will you be happier? That's my big question, and I'm not so certain that that's not the case.
Honestly, to bring it back to the Hegelian dialectic, I think, and I think this comports with Morris's sort of a way of envisioning this, is he doesn't call us to return to anything. He uses the past and mythologies as a inspiration to drive us forward to a future that posits our original position that created its own problems that we sought to solve with new solutions, and those new solutions have created new problems that we can then find new solutions to transcend them and realize a world that is more compatible with, as Marx would say, our species being, and expressive of our species being, that doesn't return us to hunter-gatherer societies, but rather uses the developments that have come before us to transcend the crippling inhumanity of the social structures that we've found ourselves in.
I think that might actually be the difference between socialism and anarcho-libertarianism or anarcho-syndicalism, right? Like, I mean, as somebody who's more in that spectrum, I see myself in the future living in sort of a Mad Max world.
Yeah.
I am quite emphatic on this point because my background is first and foremost environmental politics. Like what I knew first and what continues to sort of motivate so much of the work I do is, actually looking at policies and ways of thinking about organizing our physical existences that are compatible with the reality that we inhabit. And one of the things that leaps out very quickly and makes all the like international climate conferences and literally every climate policy that has ever been written from a national to a municipal scale just look like the gibbering of a crazy person, is that they all assume the fundamental motivating framework they're always starting with is, okay, how do we keep all of this economic activity occurring, but like make it stop destroying the world, so like, yeah, we still got to mine all the Bitcoin and everything like that, but how do we do that without destroying ourselves? And if you literally just don't start with that assumption, if you're
Right.
literally just like, okay, there's a whole lot of useless economic activity going on, but do we want like enough plastic to manufacture the medical equipment that like your grandma needs to stay alive? And do we want, if you just like literally take that perspective, suddenly the world looks very, very different in a vast range of possibilities, like a real dialogue, like what you were saying. Like, we could consciously choose to make ourselves in our life in so many different ways if we weren't like, yeah, okay, like some people got a monopoly on violence, they control all the world's resources, and we just have to let them do anything they want to make money, but we have to make it green and sustainable, like.
Right.
There's this infinite landscape of things we could try out. There really is.
Frankly, take a page out of the Luddites' book and target the technologies that make our lives worse, specifically as things to just to blow up and get rid of.
Think about that for a second. If if the real potential of AI was unleashed, right, then we didn't need, a lot of us would not need to work anymore, right? That translates to a very scary scenario under these certain circumstances right now. But, at the end of the day, if we could abolish work, right, then we could all just hang out.
Right.
Wouldn't that be nice? Like, wouldn't it be nice if we could just like do what we wanted to do, be creative with our existence, right? Abolish all of this like socioeconomic dread and terror, right? Yeah, but that's not what's going to happen. We know that, right? We know that AI is going to be used to exploit people even further, right? Because there is that, monopoly of violence and a certain class of people who sit there and basically have designed their entire existence on, killing us off in different ways.
Yeah, it'll be used to lower wages and lay people off, and that's so that the people who own it or own various means of production can aggregate more surplus value to themselves. To bring it back to back around to sort of a maybe a concluding question to contemplate, as the specifically picturing our. I think we've agreed that animism is a useful perspective to take that helps us to solve certain problems that we've created collectively as a human species. That poses to me Lenin's old adage of what is to be done. What does it look like to implement these things in practice? How does a world where we start to use this and spread it perhaps, or allow it to be adopted by those who are interested in it, however you want to phrase that or put it, what does that look like in practice? I know it's an easy question, so
it's an interesting. There's something that I feel personally. I mean, just to offer like a very brief historical perspective. From the time I was an adolescent, my political homeland was the so-called radical environmental movement, Earth First and all that, right? Which I very much think at that time, when I entered in the mid 90s, really was essentially like an animist revival. Those are really the best terms to think of it in. But crucially, because of this fragmenting tendency in the modern world, there is this little bit like something I've noticed is that a lot of the time, if you're performing rituals or producing media or trying to engage people in this framework of collective meaning and connection to the world, it often occurs at the expense of concrete political projects or scientific understandings or whatever. And the thing that I'm really militating for is more of a synthesis, which is really something that I feel like I did experience in that movement for some number of years, and then we kind of succumbed to our own version of the first international split. But there was like a lot of that's a whole that's too much to get into, but but basically, without ever saying it, I feel like a faction what became pretty anti-animist and ultimately won. And their story was, we're going to engage more people because we're going to lead with we're going to take away all this life is sacred, everything is interconnected stuff, because people don't vibe with that. And we're going to like talk about their concrete material interests, and really what happened was the movement just went into total decline when that became when we stopped having that that sort of like core framework of values. But it wasn't like we did do rituals, we had all these participatory ceremonies around fires and stuff, but we also went out and did things that were very like we took action. And so for me, that's kind of like what I'm doing right now personally, that I think offers some kind of like broad conceptual, model of thing that people can do in all kinds of different ways, is I'm trying to produce events that combine what I just call it like knowledge, meaning, and action, but some kind of like lecture, theoretical discussion, something like that, some kind of like ritual, art, ceremony, participatory group thing. And then something that we're actually like doing to influence the world in some way. But yeah, to me, that's the thing. It's to not get into like a compartment where like, oh, now I'm on, I've changed the channel to like the animism channel, so now I'm not on team like we need an energy policy, or team like universal basic income. It's synthesis. It's the synthesis.
I think divesting is the best approach, and that's a on micro to macro level, in all its forms. So that means divesting from certain habits and behaviors and ways of being in the world. And to give you perhaps an easy example, share more. Just just share more, right? I think a lot of us think of like, oh, if I give something and receive nothing in return, then I'm somehow stupid. Then I got fooled or something like that. And I certainly feel like that once in a while. But on the other hand, I'm also like, what? Fuck it. If I've shared something out there, then I have done an animist thing, because what I've done is that I have taken energy from one place to and transported it to another place, and ensured that something there could live, right. At the end of the day, that's what that is. On bigger levels, you can always have animist conversations with people, that can inspire them to think differently about the world, that can inspire political action in different ways, that can inspire laws being made, right? Like that has happened in, is it Ecuador, I think, that recognizes the personhood of forests and rivers and such, right? That's direct animist political action that has happened there, because there's enough consensus, right? We lack that consensus in our society, but it's possible to create it. And I think it starts with the small things and then can build up from there. And when I say divest, I also mean, create spaces where animism can exist, right? Where people can learn about it in direct contact. Like, for instance, Cascadian Midsummer is a great place for people to learn about animism if they have not come into contact with it before, because you guys, you are animists in all your different forms, right? I remember it was one of the rituals where people were invited to invoke whichever spirits they wanted, or something like that, and it was an amazing experience to see like people calling out these names of deities from all kinds of traditions, right? That's animistic sharing right there. And so, like, at the end of the day, you don't have to, like, go out and create some kind of like political action group that has like this particular focus, and then has also the implied possibility of like fracturing because of all the strange things that always happen in those kind of groups, right? You can do it in so many different ways. And I think one of the best ways is actually, or one of the most animist things to do, is to be creative about your existence, right? And think differently, think creatively. That might be having a conversation with a tree once in a while if you need that. And it might also be to, tell people that you have had that conversation. It ever so often it happens to me when I'm teaching at CU Boulder, that I tell my students that they need to go talk to squirrels more. And that comes directly from the Nordic story world, right? We have the tree and an eagle up top and snakes below and a squirrel that runs up and down the tree trunk, right? The squirrel is the messenger between above and below, the heavens and the underworld, and it knows everything in between. And that little image right there of a bird in the top of a tree and snakes below and a squirrel that's running up and down, all my students will know that image because that is present on campus. We have garter snakes that hang out by the roots of the trees, and we have squirrels that are running around, and we have birds up top, right? So I usually try to tell my students, hey, go talk to a squirrel more. And they think I'm batshit crazy, and I probably am, and it's okay.
Yeah, I don't to try to venture something of an answer to my own question. I don't have an answer, but I guess maybe to echo Arnold, what you were saying earlier about how what I've tried my hand at in the past was sort of traditional leftist organizing to change the world, and I found myself just infinitely frustrated with it, and found myself just banging my head against a wall and getting absolutely nowhere, and feeling like the whole thing was pointless. I feel lucky that I walked away from that without relinquishing my commitments, my principles, but I did relinquish my theory of how to change the world when I found that it wasn't working. And I think the biggest obstacle to effective political action in the world today is that widely commented on social phenomenon of increasing social isolation, alienation, the bowling alone thesis, that social life is collapsing increasingly every day, and it has been for decades, since the post-war period in the Western world. And I think that one of the most important things that anyone who wants to make their own lives better and try to make the world better for other people is to be an agent of helping to recreate society, recreate social spaces. And toward that end, that's, Matthias, you brought up Cascadian Midsummer. That's a major incentive for me behind organizing that is finding finding an organic community that exists and investing myself into helping to build it out and increase the space that it has to flourish. I think is an incredibly fruitful endeavor. And that endeavor, I think, would be extremely harmed by predicating it around agreement on first principles of political beliefs or whatever. In order to be able to participate in this community, one must agree with this list of political tenets or something like that. I think that would harm this project. I think that we have to build community, and community means integration with difference and different people, different perspectives, different worldviews, different experiences, different beliefs and commitments, and we all just come together and build relationship, not rather than colliding with each other, trying to win out my perspective beats your perspective or whatever, but rather just building a network of relationships that exists for their own sake, in community around just a community practice of one sort or another. That's what makes it an organic community already existing, was that people are finding meaning here. They're showing up and they're doing this thing already just out of an instinctive impulse to do so. And this community had this sort of animistic impulse already there. And so one of my purposes in trying to organize this thing is trying to help that flourish and grow. And I think that if we can, so my aim is to, and I try to call others to do this as well. Others who have a lot of people who listen to this podcast, for example, the Regrettable Century, come to the world with very strong political commitments already. And so what I would challenge people to do is do not lose your political commitments, but don't build your entire personality and life and community and social sphere around them. Rather, build community and personality and social life and have your political commitments be one factor of your engagement with that community and that social world. For me, I other people don't have the same principle. People listening to this podcast probably are not already into animism. Maybe some people will take this conversation as inspiration to look into it and maybe learn more about it. But that's sort of where I find inspiration and meaning in the world, in this weird world we find ourselves in. And I think it's a useful thing that's worth investing my time and my energy, my labor into helping to sort of grow this space for people to also engage in it. I think we've, so I don't have an answer to what is to be done other than, we've got to just consciously cultivate the public sphere that is increasingly disintegrating.
Can I
world.
attach a comment to that? Because you know what, one of the things that I have at least always been told in school, right, was that modernism came with the big isms, right, the ideologies, and that I think is entirely true, right? And what characterizes these ideologies? Well, and one of the things that's very prominent is that the adherents to the ideologies demand that you submit to this particular ideology versus the other one, right? Like there's no in between. There's no ability for you to be a person in between these two polarized, like seen as polarized political positions or ideological positions, right? And that, of course, then begs the question: when does that way of thinking emerge, right? And if we trace it back in European history, we can see it emerging in different places at different times, right? You have absolutism in France as one point in the 1600s. We have we have tendencies of this way of thinking in small state Italy in the Renaissance, right? With the different princes there. We have this tendency shows up in imperial Rome as well, but it goes back and forth, up and down. Sometimes it's there more, and sometimes it's not, and so on, right? And then you have societies both in Europe, but especially outside of Europe, that organizes differently, right? And I'm thinking especially indigenous populations here in North America, especially around the Great Lakes, who have organized around parliamentarism, essentially, right? This notion that, well, we talk about our problems, we work our problems out together, and it's only in the most dire circumstances that somebody chooses to leave. Otherwise, there's an expectation of give on both sides, just like, those societies, had a very different approach to handling what we call crime, right? Murders, for instance, would not be necessarily an exclusion of the perpetrator, but another situation where the perpetrator is adopted by the family who belongs to the person who was murdered, those kinds of things, right? An entirely different way of thinking, and that thinking is, animist, it's collectivist, it's a communal way of thinking, right? And we can contrast that to that modernistic way of thinking that we have been imbued with from Western cultures, right? Which is exactly the opposite, right? That leaves the individual out there in the wasteland to fend for themselves. You're either with us or you're not, and your personal opinion doesn't matter in it.
Right? Yeah. Arnold, did you have any other closing thoughts you want to throw in there?
Yeah, I'll kind of affirm what you were saying in a very, I think, hopefully concise way, which is just that at this point, I've spent more than 3 decades doing a lot of very principled political engagement and huge diversity of different projects, whatever. But I can trace all of that back to a revelatory moment, to an animist awakening that I experienced looking into the eyes of a raven when I was 16 years old in rural Vermont, right? And so what I'm getting at here is that nobody rationally argued me into all of the many different sort of strategies and tactics that I've employed. Fundamentally, they all emerge from an experiential state. And I just think you're right in saying, it's like we have to be thinking about the core experiential process that we're in, from which the tangible projects of survival emerge.
Рабочие и крестьяне не смогут прожить без нас. Без нас некому будет установить порядок, определить работу, принудить к труду. Без нас все развалится и государство распадется.